The forest smelled of burnt ozone and scorched crystal. I found her pinned under wreckage, golden eyes meeting mine with equal parts fear and hope. Her leg was shattered, but her grip on my sleeve was desperate. "Please don't depart," she whispered. In that moment, I faced a choice. Follow protocol or save a life that wasn't supposed to matter. Crystalline trees stood scorched and smoking from plasma fire. The air shimmered with heat distortion above fractured mineral surfaces, each facet reflecting the destruction in jagged fragments. Bravo Squad's routine survey mission had turned into a massacre in seconds flat. One moment we were setting perimeter sensors. The next we were caught in overlapping fields of fire from positions we never detected. Alien ambush tactics left no time for organized retreat. They used the forest's natural acoustics against us, their weapons firing in sequence to create confusion about their numbers and positions. I hit the ground as Corporal Meeks vanished in a flash of blue energy, his armor offering no more protection than paper. The tactical channel dissolved into overlapping casualty reports and broken commands. I crawled through undergrowth that crackled with residual energy. Purple mosses sparked where my gloves touched them, discharging built-up plasma static. Each movement required careful calculation. Too fast would attract attention, too slow would leave me exposed. The metallic scent of burnt ozone mixed with coppery blood from the wound in my shoulder. A through and through that had missed bone but burned like acid. My medkit felt impossibly light against the scale of injuries around me. 3 doses of coagulant, 2 trauma patches, 1 stim injector. Enough for maybe 1 critical case if I rationed carefully. Through the smoke, I glimpsed Sergeant Valquez trying to drag Peters to cover, both of them taking fire from the ridge above. Then the plasma round caught Valquez in the chest plate and he simply came apart. Every shadow seemed to hold another threat waiting. The crystalline trees cast overlapping patterns that deceived the eye, making stationary objects appear to shift position. I kept my sidearm drawn but knew its charge was nearly depleted. Standard-issue weapons proved inadequate against their energy shielding. We'd learned that the hard way in those first devastating seconds. Then I heard it. A low moan beneath twisted metal. The sound cut through the ringing in my ears, human enough to trigger my training response. I moved toward it, keeping low behind a toppled tree formation whose internal structures glowed with dying light. The wreckage of a hoverbike formed an improvised trap, its anti-grav unit still emitting a weak hum that masked other sounds. Beneath it, golden eyes tracked my movement with animal intensity. Not human eyes. The pupils were vertical slits, the irises flecked with copper highlights that caught the fading light. The being was pinned at the waist by the bike's main supports bar, armor cracked open to reveal blue-tinged skin beneath. One hand still gripped a weapon unlike any I'd seen, its energy source flickering weakly. Those eyes held no plea yet, only assessment, calculation. The cold measurement of one predator recognizing another in contested territory. Her body was pinned at an unnatural angle under the bike's frame, the main support beam crushing her midsection against the fractured crystal ground. The right leg showed compound fractures through the alien armor, white bone fragments visible amid the torn synthetic fibers and blue-tinged tissue. The limb bent where no joint existed, foot twisted nearly backward against the ankle. Blue blood seeped steadily from multiple lacerations, pooling beneath the wreckage in viscous patches that steamed faintly in the cool air. She clutched a plasma weapon with fading strength, fingers locked around the grip in what appeared to be muscle memory, rather than conscious intent. The weapon's energy cell glowed dimly, indicating near total depletion. Her gaze held complex calculations, threat assessment versus desperation playing out in the minute adjustments of her pupils, the slight tension around her mouth. I recognized the look. I'd seen it in human soldiers dying in mud on 3 different worlds. That moment when training clashes with survival instinct and something entirely new emerges from the collision. Her breathing came in shallow, pained rasps that misted the air before her face. Each inhalation seemed to cost her something vital, the exhales carrying a soft whistling sound that suggested lung damage. The weapon wavered but didn't rise to target me, the barrel dipping toward the ground as her strength faded. The subtle tremor in her arm spoke of someone fighting to maintain control while their body was failing them. I made the first move, hands open, medkit visible. I kept my movements slow and predictable, turning my palms upward to show I held nothing offensive. The white medical case with its red cross emblem seemed absurdly inadequate against the scale of destruction around us. But sometimes, Symbols transcend species barriers better than language ever could. Universal medical symbols occasionally bridge divides that diplomacy cannot, though I'd never tested that theory under plasma fire with an armed combatant. She watched my hands, her own tightening on the weapon. Her fingers, long and slender with an extra joint, adjusted their grip minutely. The movement caused fresh blue blood to well from a gash on her forearm, dripping steadily onto the crystalline soil. Her eyes never left mine, the gold irises contracting and expanding as they tracked each subtle shift in my posture. The standoff stretched between us, measured in heartbeats and strained breaths. Two enemies caught in a moment that protocol had never prepared either of us to face. The wreckage shifted slightly with a groan of stressed metal, and her body tensed against the pain. Her weapon hand trembled violently for a moment before she regained control. I saw the decision happen in her eyes. Not surrender exactly, but a recalculation of priorities. The weapon's muzzle dipped another fraction toward the ground, though her grip remained firm. She was weighing her options with the cold precision of someone who knew exactly how little time she had left to choose. Her voice emerged as a strained whisper, translated by my helmet's audio processors after a fractional delay. The words came through with the flat tonality of machine interpretation, stripped of nuance yet carrying undeniable weight. "Please don't depart." The simple phrase hung between us, amplified by the silence of the battlefield. It wasn't just a request for physical presence. Something in the cadence suggested deeper cultural significance, a meaning that went beyond literal translation. The words functioned as both surrender and challenge simultaneously. She wasn't begging for mercy so much as proposing terms, offering something through the act of vulnerability. Her eyes maintained that unnerving directness, the golden irises fixed on mine as if measuring the exact effect of her words. The weapon in her hand finally went slack, fingers loosening their death grip on the energy cell housing. Her hand left the weapon to clutch my armored sleeve. The movement was shockingly deliberate, each finger settling against the composite plating with precise placement. The grip spoke of absolute desperation despite her failing strength, not the panicked clawing of someone drowning, but the calculated hold of someone anchoring themselves to their only possible salvation. I felt the pressure through the armor's tactile sensors, a firm insistence that contradicted her weakened state. Protocol demanded immediate retreat and report of enemy positions. Standard operating procedure required evacuating the engagement zone, preserving intelligence and alerting command to hostile capabilities. The training module echoed in my mind. No tactical advantage justifies unnecessary risk to medical personnel. Every instinct drilled through years of service screamed to disengage, to fall back to established coordinates, to prioritize mission integrity over individual survival. Medic training screamed about stabilizing the injured. The triage protocols fought against the evacuation orders, presenting counter-arguments in the voice of my first field medicine instructor. A life in immediate danger takes precedence over theoretical future casualties. The conflict wasn't academic. I could feel the two philosophies warring in my muscle memory, each trying to command my next movement. I saw the leg injury clearly now, bone fragments visible through torn flesh, the white shards stark against blue-tinged tissue. The fracture ran from mid-thigh to just above the knee, with secondary breaks radiating outward like cracks in crystal. The limb was bent at an angle that should have been impossible, the joint structures clearly compromised beyond natural alignment. Each slight movement produced fresh bleeding from multiple arterial sources. Blue-tinged blood pooled beneath the wreckage, the viscous fluid spreading slowly across the fractured crystalline ground. The color was wrong, that deep cobalt blue instead of human red, but the pattern was familiar, that same terrible signature of severe trauma I'd seen on a dozen battlefields. The pool deepened near the main fracture site, suggesting major vessel damage that would prove fatal without immediate intervention. The choice crystallized: soldier versus healer. Not as abstract concepts, but as physical imperatives demanding contradictory actions. One path required withdrawal, tactical assessment, strategic thinking. The other demanded immediate hands-on intervention, field medicine under fire, abandoning protocol for direct action. The wreckage groaned again, settling deeper into the crystal soil, and her grip tightened on my sleeve in response. The pressure felt like an anchor point in a suddenly fluid reality, where all previous certainties had dissolved into smoke and blood. The hoverbike weighed more than any human vehicle I'd encountered, its mass feeling like solid bedrock rather than machinery. When I braced against the main spar, the composite material barely flexed under my weight. My boots slid on the crystalline soil, unable to find proper traction against the smooth mineral surfaces. Alien materials had density factors I hadn't anticipated. The frame components felt unnaturally heavy for their size, as if the molecular structure packed more mass into less space. Each section I tested for leverage resisted movement with stubborn inertia, the physics unfamiliar enough to make standard rescue techniques nearly useless. The wreckage had settled into a stable position that fought against any attempt to shift it. Leverage points required careful calculation around her body. I had to position my hands and shoulder against sections that wouldn't crush her further if something gave way unexpectedly. The main support beam pressed directly across her midsection, but secondary structures trapped her legs at awkward angles. Finding purchase points that wouldn't cause collateral damage took precious minutes of visual inspection and testing. She screamed when the metal shifted the first time. The sound emerged as a sharp, choked cry that cut off abruptly as she clamped down on the pain. Her body went rigid beneath the wreckage, every muscle contracting against the sudden movement. The scream wasn't human, but communicated suffering with universal clarity. The sound cut through the forest's unnatural silence. In the aftermath of the ambush, the woods had gone quiet except for the occasional crackle of discharging energy. Her cry echoed against the crystalline trees, carrying farther than I would have preferred. I froze for 3 heartbeats, listening for any response from the forest, any indication that the sound had drawn attention. I used my armor's servos to augment lifting capacity. The systems weren't designed for heavy lifting. They were meant for endurance and mobility under combat load. I felt the strain transfer through the suit's framework, servos whining at the unexpected demand. The armor transferred the stress to my own body through the contact points, making my muscles burn with the effort. The frame groaned protest but lifted centimeters. A metallic screech came from stressed joints and fractured components. The entire structure rose unevenly, one side lifting while the other remained grounded. Blue sparks flashed where torn wiring made contact with damaged power cells. The gap I created was minimal, but represented the first actual progress. Her body remained trapped by a twisted support beam. The main weight had shifted, but secondary structures still pinned her legs and lower torso. The beam had bent during the crash, forming a cage-like structure that required more precise manipulation to open. Each attempt to widen the gap made the entire wreckage shift alarmingly. Sweat dripped into my eyes inside the sealed helmet. The environmental system struggled to manage the sudden heat load from my exertion. Moisture beaded on my forehead and ran into my vision, blurring the critical details of the wreckage configuration. I blinked repeatedly, trying to clear my sight without releasing the precarious hold I'd achieved. She whispered again, the words barely audible through my helmet's external pickups. "Don't let go." The translation came through cleanly this time, without the earlier distortion. Her hand had found my ankle now, fingers pressing against the armor plating with surprising strength. The contact felt like an electrical current running between us, a physical manifestation of the trust she was placing in an enemy soldier. I adjusted my grip, feeling the servos strain at their maximum tolerance, and held the position despite the burning in my shoulders and back. Her physiology presented immediate challenges the moment I opened the medkit. The scanner readings defied all standard triage protocols, displaying anatomical structures that matched nothing in the human medical database. Each reading required interpretation through layers of uncertainty, every decision carrying potential consequences I couldn't fully anticipate. The display showed organ clusters in wrong placements, bone density measurements off the charts, and energy signatures that suggested biological systems operating on different principles entirely. The bones showed denser molecular structure on scanner. The readout indicated calcium composites reinforced with mineral deposits that made her skeleton approximately 40% heavier than human equivalent mass. This explained the hoverbike's crushing weight but complicated treatment. Setting fractures would require substantially more force, and the risk of shattering bone during manipulation increased exponentially. The fracture lines appeared cleaner than human breaks, suggesting more brittle structural properties despite the density. Vascular roots didn't match human patterns. Instead of the familiar arterial branching, her circulatory system formed interwoven networks that created redundant pathways around injury sites. Major vessels ran along bone rather than through muscle tissue, protected by those dense skeletal structures. The scanner showed multiple connection points between what appeared to be primary and secondary circulatory systems, a design that suggested evolutionary adaptation to traumatic injury. Blue blood suggested copper-based oxygenation. The hemocyanin equivalent created that distinctive cobalt coloration and changed viscosity characteristics dramatically. Clotting factors worked faster than human blood, but created weaker seals that required reinforcement. The scanner indicated higher oxygen capacity per volume but lower pressure distribution, meaning hemorrhages would be less immediately catastrophic, but tissue oxygenation would suffer more quickly during blood loss. I administered local anesthetic with hopeful uncertainty. The human neural blockers might do nothing, or might cause catastrophic reactions in an alien nervous system. I used the lowest possible dose initially, watching her reactions closely. Her breathing pattern changed within seconds, becoming slightly deeper and more regular. The tense lines around her eyes softened marginally, suggesting at least partial efficacy. I administered additional measured doses while monitoring vital signs through the scanner's limited capabilities. Her nervous system responded with fascinating redundancies. When I tested sensation distal to the injury site, she reported tingling rather than complete numbness. The scanner showed electrical activity rerouting around the blocked pathways, finding alternative routes to maintain partial function. This explained her continued muscle control despite significant trauma and suggested neurological adaptations far beyond human capabilities. Pain response manifested as color shifts in skin pigmentation. As the anesthetic took effect, the blue-tinged skin around the injury site paled to a soft lavender hue. Earlier, during the most painful moments of wreckage removal, it had darkened nearly to navy with subtle bioluminescent flecks appearing along stress points. These visual cues provided continuous feedback about her condition, despite the language barrier and translation limitations. Field improvisation became necessary for stabilization. Standard human splints and braces proved inadequate for her limb structure and bone density. I used armor fragments as makeshift splints, cutting sections from damaged plating with my combat knife. The composite material provided rigid support that could handle the weight of her denser bones. I padded the interior with sterile dressings from my kit, creating a functional if crude immobilization device. She cooperated through what must have been agony. When I needed to realign the major fracture, she braced herself against a crystal formation and watched the procedure with detached intensity. Her breathing remained controlled despite the obvious pain, and she provided subtle indications when adjustments were needed. This wasn't passive endurance but active participation in her own treatment, a collaboration that crossed species boundaries through shared purpose. Her fingers maintained contact with my forearm throughout the procedure, not clutching but resting there as if maintaining some essential connection. She offered her name as I worked, Sia. The word came softly as I adjusted the makeshift splint around her fractured leg, the sound emerging between measured breaths. Her pronunciation carried subtle inflections my translator struggled to fully capture, the two syllables containing nuances that probably meant more in her native tongue. I glanced up from the medical work to meet her gaze, finding her watching me with that same analytical intensity, but now edged with something closer to acknowledgement. The gesture felt significant beyond simple identification. In 15 years of frontier service, I'd encountered 7 non-human species with naming customs ranging from transactional to ceremonial. None offered identifiers casually. The act always carried weight, establishing relationship parameters that varied wildly across cultures. Her offering felt like the unlocking of a door I hadn't realized was closed. A shift in status from threat to something more complex. Names have power in every culture I've studied. Human soldiers etch them on tags worn around necks. The Martians weave them into genetic signatures. Belters exchange them only after shared danger. I'd seen naming rituals that involved blood, data transfer, even temporary neural linking. Her simple verbal offering felt both profound and precarious, a gift that might come with obligations I couldn't yet comprehend. Her cooperation became more active despite the pain. Where before she had endured treatment passively, now she began participating. She adjusted her position slightly to provide better access to the injury, moving with careful precision that minimized fresh damage. Her hands, previously clenched at her sides, now assisted with small tasks, holding dressings in place indicating pressure points, stabilizing sections of the splint I was constructing. She guided my hands to critical pressure points. Her fingers, cool against my armored gloves, directed my pressure to specific locations along her thigh. The points didn't correspond to human anatomical landmarks, following instead patterns that suggested different neurological mapping. When I applied pressure where indicated, her breathing eased noticeably, the tense lines around her mouth softening. She indicated 3 more points that reduced bleeding from secondary vessels without requiring additional clotting agents. Her knowledge of her own anatomy proved invaluable. She demonstrated how to test nerve function by tapping specific tendon groupings, showing responses that confirmed whether pathways remained intact. She indicated which bleeding points required immediate attention and which could be left temporarily, prioritizing treatment based on her understanding of her body's redundancy systems. This wasn't guesswork, but precise biological knowledge, the kind usually possessed only by trained medical specialists. The dynamic shifted from captor-captive to collaboration. The weapon lay forgotten beside her, its energy cell completely drained. Our interaction became a dialogue of gestures and instructions, the medical emergency creating its own communication protocol. I found myself checking with her before each significant manipulation, reading her subtle nods or slight head shakes. The forest's threats receded slightly into background noise, the immediate medical crisis creating a bubble of focused cooperation. I introduced myself properly. Alex Chen, combat medic. The words felt inadequate after her meaningful offering, my human naming convention seeming blunt by comparison. I included the title deliberately, establishing role parameters within whatever relationship was forming. The medic designation created specific expectations and limitations, a professional framework that might prevent misunderstanding later. Titles established professional boundaries and purposes. She repeated combat medic, softly testing the translation, her head tilted slightly in what I interpreted as acknowledgement rather than confusion. The designation seemed to satisfy some internal checklist, her posture relaxing another degree. The medic title apparently crossed cultural boundaries with more clarity than my name alone would have carried. The forest felt less hostile with names exchanged. The crystalline trees still cast threatening shadows, and the occasional distant crackle of energy still raised my guard. But the space between us had shifted fundamentally. We were no longer just human and alien, soldier and enemy, but Alex and Saya, medic and patient. The designations created a temporary truce that the forest itself seemed to recognize, the oppressive weight of being watched easing marginally. I finished securing the last splint fastener, and her hand came to rest briefly on my wrist in what felt like gratitude. The gesture needed no translation. The fracture patterns revealed biological marvels when I scanned the leg properly. The break lines followed crystalline structures within the bone matrix, creating clean separation planes rather than the jagged fractures of human bones. Each fragment maintained structural integrity at the microscopic level, suggesting evolutionary adaptation to high-impact environments. The scanner showed mineral reinforcement along stress lines that would have shattered human bone under equivalent trauma. Bone density suggested high-gravity evolution. The readings came back 40% heavier than human equivalent mass, with compressive strength measurements off the standard scale. This explained both the difficulty in moving the wreckage and the clean fracture patterns. Her people evolved for worlds where structural failure meant instant death. The bones contained metallic deposits that showed up as bright sparks on the scanner, likely reinforcement against constant heavy loading. Muscle attachments followed efficient engineering principles. Instead of the layered overlapping systems humans evolved, her musculature used direct tendon-to-bone connections with minimal wasted tissue. The arrangement provided maximum force transfer with reduced risk of tearing under stress. Each muscle group had backup fibers that could take over during partial failure, creating redundant systems throughout the limb structure. The design prioritized function over flexibility, built for power rather than range of motion. I observed redundant nerve pathways throughout the limb. Major neural bundles ran through protected canals in the dense bone rather than through soft tissue. Secondary networks followed parallel routes that could maintain partial function if primary pathways were damaged. When I tested sensation distal to the injury, she reported tingling rather than complete numbness. The backup systems were already compensating. This explained her ability to maintain muscle control despite significant trauma. Her circulatory system had backup routes around injuries. The scanner showed auxiliary vessels running parallel to major arteries, with connecting channels that could reroute blood flow during vascular damage. The blue blood moved through these systems with lower pressure than human circulation, reducing hemorrhage risk, but requiring more complex clotting mechanisms. I watched on the display as flow patterns shifted around the injury sites, the biology adapting in real time to the trauma. The scanner showed 2 major arteries, where humans have 1. These twin vessels ran along either side of the bone, protected by the dense mineral structures. Both showed damage from the fracture, but the redundancy meant complete circulation loss was unlikely. The bleeding came from smaller accessory vessels that fed the muscle groups, creating multiple points that required attention rather than one catastrophic flow. Bleeding control required adapted techniques. Standard human coagulants proved only partially effective on her copper-based blood chemistry. The clotting process worked faster but created weaker seals that needed reinforcement. I used a combination of pressure points she indicated and modified tourniquet techniques that accounted for the dual arterial system. Each intervention required verification through her feedback, subtle nods or head shakes that guided the pressure application. I used field cauterization on unfamiliar tissue types. The plasma cutter from my toolkit provided precise burning at low settings, but the response of her tissues was unpredictable. The blue-tinged skin and muscle contracted differently than human tissue, requiring lower temperatures and shorter application times. The smell was wrong. Ozone and something mineral rather than the organic scent of cauterized human flesh. Each application made her flinch despite the anesthesia, her body responding to the heat even when nerve blockers should have prevented sensation. Her pain responses helped guide treatment accuracy. The color shifts in her skin provided continuous feedback about tissue stress and circulation changes. Areas turning darker blue indicated vascular congestion, while paling suggested reduced flow. She also used subtle hand signals to indicate when cauterization was effective versus causing collateral damage. This biofeedback allowed precision I couldn't have achieved with scanners alone. The leg stabilized but would need advanced care. The makeshift splint and field treatments would prevent immediate bleeding or further damage, but the complex fractures required proper surgical intervention. The bone fragments needed realignment under imaging. The circulatory repairs demanded microsurgical techniques, and the nerve damage might require regeneration therapy. What I'd accomplished was emergency preservation, not healing. The limb remained functional in the sense that it was attached and circulating blood, but full recovery would demand technology far beyond my field kit's capabilities. She tested weight-bearing briefly, her hand on my shoulder for balance, and nodded once, acknowledging both the temporary solution and the limitations of field medicine. Saya warned me about the forest's defensive systems as I finished securing her splint. Her voice remained low, the words carefully measured for my translator. She spoke of integrated networks that made our previous tactical assessment seem dangerously naive. The ambush we'd suffered wasn't just military, it was ecological, the environment itself acting as combatant. Her warning carried the weight of personal experience, the certainty of someone who understood the systems from within. Guardian technology blended biology and machinery in ways human science hadn't imagined. The crystalline trees weren't merely mineral formations but living components of a larger defense network. Their internal structures contained both organic circuitry and sophisticated sensors, grown rather than manufactured. The integration was seamless. No visible seams between biological and technological elements, just unified systems that functioned with terrifying efficiency. This explained why our scanners had detected nothing before the attack. Crystalline trees functioned as sensory organs throughout the forest. Each tree acted as both individual sensor and relay node, creating overlapping fields of awareness that covered the entire territory. Their mineral structures could detect vibrations, thermal signatures, energy emissions, and biological markers simultaneously. The network processed information collectively, identifying threats through consensus analysis rather than individual judgment. This distributed intelligence made deception exceptionally difficult. The forest didn't rely on single points of failure. The undergrowth could report movement to central intelligence, What appeared to be random vegetation actually contained delicate sensory filaments that registered pressure and disturbance. Stepping on certain plants triggered subtle chemical changes that spread through root networks, alerting the system to intrusion patterns. Even careful movement created detectable effects: shadows falling across light-sensitive growths, breath-disturbing spore clusters, body heat affecting temperature-sensitive blooms. Complete stealth required understanding which patterns the system ignored as natural occurrences. Sentinels the size of armored vehicles patrolled sectors on regular intervals. These weren't random patrols, but systematic sweeps designed to catch anything that slipped through the passive detection systems. They moved with programmed efficiency, covering territory in patterns that left no gaps over time. Their sensors could detect life signs through solid rock and energy shielding, making conventional hiding places ineffective. Each sentinel carried weaponry capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously with frightening accuracy. Our position became more vulnerable with each passing minute. The wreckage provided some concealment but couldn't hide us from systematic search patterns. The residual energy signatures from the crash would draw attention eventually, and our biological signs would stand out against the background once the system dedicated resources to analysis. Every moment spent stationary increased the probability of detection exponentially. The forest's memory was perfect. Once it identified a threat, it never forgot. The wreckage provided temporary concealment, but not safety. The twisted metal and scattered components created a visual barrier that might defeat casual observation, but the forest didn't rely on visual identification alone. Our heat signatures, respiratory byproducts, and even minute energy emissions from my equipment would eventually register on the sensory network. The wreckage's own energy leakage might buy us time by creating interference, but that protection was diminishing as systems powered down. Saya knew protocols to avoid detection patterns. She understood the system's blind spots and processing limitations. Certain movement rhythms triggered less response. Specific pathways attracted less attention. Particular times between movements reduced scrutiny. Her knowledge came from living with these systems, understanding their logic rather than fighting their capabilities. She could read the forest's subtle indicators, color shifts in vegetation, sound patterns in the canopy, even air current changes that signaled system attention. We needed to move before systematic sweeps began. The initial ambush response would soon transition to methodical cleaning operations. The forest would deploy more specialized units designed for thorough searching rather than rapid engagement. These would employ scanning techniques that could penetrate our limited concealment. The transition usually occurred within a standard time frame that Sia seemed to recognize from experience. Our window for relatively safe movement was closing wrap. I fashioned a drag litter from wreckage materials, selecting components with care. The hoverbike's seat padding provided cushioning when layered with pieces of insulation from shattered control panels. I used wiring harnesses to lash together sections of lightweight frame members, creating a flexible platform that could navigate uneven terrain. The construction took precious minutes, each moment heightening the risk of detection. But haste would have created a transport that caused more harm than remaining stationary. Her weight distribution required careful calculation due to the leg injury and her species' denser bone structure. I positioned the main support beams to align with her torso's center of mass, avoiding pressure on the damaged limb. The litter needed to distribute weight evenly, while allowing me to maintain control during movement over rough ground. I tested the balance repeatedly, adjusting the harness attachments until the litter remained level when lifted. Her increased mass meant I had to use my armor's servo assistance constantly, draining power reserves I might need later. The leg needed immobilization during movement to prevent further damage. I secured the splinted limb with additional cross-bracing made from control rods, creating a cage-like structure around the injury site. Each strap required precise tension. Too loose would allow dangerous movement. Too tight would compromise circulation in an already stressed vascular system. I checked capillary response in her foot repeatedly, watching for color changes that would indicate restricted blood flow. The immobilization made the litter more cumbersome but prevented the fractures from worsening during transit. Pain management became our constant challenge despite the anesthetic. Each bump and jolt transmitted through the litter frame elicited sharp inhalations or minute muscle contractions she couldn't completely suppress. I administered additional low-dose blocks at regular intervals, monitoring her physiological responses for signs of overdose or adverse reactions. The medications worked imperfectly across species lines, requiring constant adjustment based on her feedback through subtle hand signals and breathing patterns. The forest's uneven terrain guaranteed we'd never achieve smooth travel. We moved in short bursts between cover points, never more than 20 meters at a time. I'd identify the next viable concealment, a dense crystal formation, a depression in the terrain, a cluster of thick vegetation, and move toward it quickly but carefully. Each movement required scanning for threats while managing the litter's awkward dimensions. The stops allowed me to check her condition, adjust medications, and reassess our route. The fragmented progress was exhausting, but reduced our visibility to the forest's sensing systems. Sia directed our path using terrain knowledge that went beyond simple navigation. She indicated specific crystal formations that provided better sensor shielding, pathways that followed natural energy currents that masked biological signatures, and avoidance zones where the forest's attention remained heightened from recent activity. Her directions came as soft whispers or hand gestures, conserving energy while maintaining essential communication. She remembered patrol patterns and system sweeps with precision, timing our movements to exploit gaps in the coverage. Her instructions saved us from 2 patrol routes that would have intersected our path. The first involved a 6-legged sentinel moving along a ridgeline we'd been approaching. She detected its approach through subtle vibrations in the crystal ground that I completely missed. The second was an aerial drone sweep that would have passed directly over our position had we not diverted into a mineral cave formation. Each avoided encounter reinforced the value of her local knowledge against my general combat training. The forest seemed to actively resist our progress beyond mere detection. Vines tightened where we needed to pass, their fibrous strands contracting to block narrow passages that appeared open moments before. The phenomenon wasn't mechanical but biological, the plant life responding to some signal we couldn't perceive. We had to change routes repeatedly, losing precious time and energy navigating around obstacles that hadn't existed during our initial approach. Root systems shifted to create obstacles that hampered the litter's movement. Thick tuberous growths emerged from the soil to form barriers across previously clear paths. The crystal trees themselves sometimes tilted slightly, their branches lowering to block overhead routes we might have used for concealment. The forest's response felt increasingly coordinated, as if the separate systems were learning our movement patterns and adapting countermeasures. Each new obstacle required physical effort to overcome, draining my strength and delaying our progress toward whatever sanctuary Sia believed we could reach. Sia explained her people's independence ethic during a rest stop beneath a crystalline overhang. Her voice remained low, the words carrying the weight of deeply ingrained cultural values. She described a society where personal achievement defined worth, where reliance on others signaled weakness rather than wisdom. The concept of teamwork existed only for specific temporary goals, never as a default operating principle. Her explanation came haltingly, as if articulating something so fundamental it rarely needed stating. Individual achievement valued above collective security in her culture. Survival of the group mattered less than personal excellence demonstrated through solitary accomplishment. Children learned to solve problems alone before seeking assistance, and adults measured status by independent successes rather than collaborative victories. This explained her initial hesitation to ask for help despite life-threatening injuries. The cultural programming ran deeper than immediate survival instincts. The system produced remarkably capable individuals but created isolation even within family units. Asking for help represented significant cultural breach among her people. The act carried social consequences that could linger for years, marking someone as dependent or inadequate. Requests for assistance required formal acknowledgement of debt that might never be fully repaid. This explained why she'd waited until absolute desperation before speaking those first words to me. The cultural barrier felt almost physical in its resistance, something that had to be overcome through tremendous willpower. Her request for assistance carried profound meaning, precisely because it violated these core values. When she whispered, "Please don't depart," she wasn't just asking for medical help, she was offering tremendous cultural concession. The words represented a willing suspension of lifelong training, a conscious setting aside of principles that normally governed every interaction. I understood then that the trust she placed in me went far beyond the immediate medical situation. I shared human leave no one behind philosophy as we continued moving. The concept seemed to puzzle her initially, the translation requiring several attempts to convey the cultural depth. I explained how this principle shaped military doctrine, exploration protocols, even civilian rescue operations. The idea that strangers would risk themselves for others without established obligation contradicted everything her culture taught. She listened intently, her golden eyes reflecting the unfamiliar concepts as we navigated between crystal formations. The contrast revealed fundamental worldview differences that went beyond language or biology. Her people saw the universe as a series of individual challenges to be met alone. Humans viewed existence as collective endeavor where strength came from mutual support. Neither approach was inherently right or wrong, just evolved from different environmental pressures and historical necessities. The divide seemed almost unbridgeable until practical necessity forced collaboration. Yet both cultures recognized courage in adversity as a universal virtue. Her people admired solitary bravery facing overwhelming odds. Humans valued courage that protected others at personal risk. The manifestations differed, but the core recognition of facing danger with resolve remained constant. This shared value created a fragile bridge between our perspectives, a common language that needed no translation. Our survival depended on bridging these gaps in real time. Each decision required negotiating between my instinct to consult and her training to decide independently. We developed hybrid protocols. She would analyze options alone, then we'd compare assessments without judgment. The process felt awkward initially, like learning to walk with an unfamiliar gait, but gradually became more natural as trust deepened. Trust developed through practical necessity rather than abstract agreement. When she guided my hands during medical procedures, when I followed her navigation instructions without question, when we divided watch responsibilities during rest periods, each small act built confidence through demonstrated reliability. The trust remained conditional, constantly tested by new challenges, but grew stronger with each successfully navigated obstacle. The alliance felt fragile but necessary, a temporary structure built across cultural fault lines. We both understood this cooperation might not survive beyond immediate danger. The unspoken agreement acknowledged that different worldviews would eventually reassert themselves. For now, the alliance served our mutual need for survival, a practical errand. The scout moved with mechanical precision that felt almost unnatural in the organic surroundings. Its 6 piston-like legs supported a central sensor dome that rotated slowly, sweeping the area with multiple detection methods simultaneously. Each leg moved in perfect synchronization, the articulated joints producing no sound despite their obvious weight and power. The machine's design favored function over stealth, its presence meant to deter as much as detect, creating psychological pressure through visible capability. We froze behind a crystalline outcrop that offered minimal concealment. The rock formation provided visual cover, but little protection against the scout's sophisticated sensors. I lowered the litter carefully, suppressing the servo's normal whine through manual override. Sia remained perfectly still, her training overriding the pain responses that must have been screaming through her nervous system. The scout continued its methodical advance, each step placing more distance between us but also bringing its sensors to bear on our position. Its sensors swept our position methodically, employing overlapping scanning patterns that left few gaps. Thermal imaging would detect our body heat against the cooler crystal. Motion sensors would register even our controlled breathing. Energy detectors might pick up my armor's low power signature. The only advantage we had was the residual energy from the earlier battle creating background interference that might mask our smaller signals. The scout paused its advance, the sensor dome halting its rotation to focus on our general area. Sia held her breath against pain responses that threatened to betray us. Her body remained rigid with control, every muscle locked against involuntary movement. I watched her skin pigmentation shift slightly along her neck, a subconscious reaction to the strain that might register on visual spectrum analyzers. Her golden eyes remained fixed on the scout, calculating its patterns with the focused intensity of someone who understood the technology intimately. The standoff stretched, measured in heartbeats and scanning cycles. I covered blue blood droplets with dirt using slow, controlled movements. The stained soil where her leg had rested might be visible to chemical sniffers or hyperspectral imagers, I used my free hand to scoop loose mineral soil over the spots, blending the evidence into the surroundings. The action required excruciating slowness. Too rapid movement would attract attention. Too slow would leave evidence exposed. Each handful of dirt felt like a declaration of presence, a risk that might trigger response. The scout paused, sensors whirring softly as it processed conflicting data. The sound was barely audible but carried through the crystalline ground to our position. Its legs adjusted minutely, shifting weight distribution to optimize stability for detailed scanning. The sensor dome tilted slightly, focusing on the area where we'd been moments before. The machine's behavior suggested interest without confirmation, the hesitation of a system weighing probabilities against programmed thresholds. It detected something, heat or vibration that registered just enough to warrant investigation, but not enough to confirm threat. The scout took 2 steps toward our position, its legs moving with that same mechanical precision. The movement brought it within 20 meters, close enough that I could see individual sensor apertures in the dome. Each lens and receptor appeared optimized for different detection methods, creating a comprehensive surveillance package that left few hiding places. We prepared for combat we couldn't win, knowing the scout's capabilities far exceeded our limited resources. My sidearm held insufficient charge for that armored chassis. Sia's weapon remained drained and useless. The litter would prevent rapid movement or effective evasion. Our only option would be to make the fight costly enough that the scout might hesitate to engage, though its programming likely valued completion over self-preservation. I positioned myself between Sia and the machine, my body becoming the only shield available. Then it moved on, following another trail that had drawn its attention. A distant energy signature or biological reading pulled the scout away, its programming prioritizing the stronger signal over our faint traces. The machine turned with smooth efficiency, its legs carrying it toward the ridgeline where our squad had made their last stand. The movement felt like divine intervention, until I remembered the scout was likely heading toward potential survivors from my team. The relief of escape immediately curdled into guilt about what might be happening elsewhere in the forest. The scout's sensors continued sweeping as it departed, reminding us that safety remained temporary at best. Saya read the forest like a living map, her golden eyes tracking patterns invisible to human sight. She noted the subtle alignment of crystal formations, the specific angles at which branches intersected, the minute variations in ground composition. Her navigation wasn't about following paths, but interpreting a complex language written across the entire landscape. Each decision came after careful observation of multiple environmental factors that together indicated safe passage or hidden danger. Trail systems deliberately misdirected outsiders through cunning design. What appeared to be clear pathways actually led into dead ends surrounded by sensor-rich vegetation. Other trails circled back to starting points after hours of travel, wasting energy and time while increasing exposure. The forest's navigation systems used human psychological tendencies against us, creating false assurances that collapsed into traps. Saya recognized these deceptive patterns instantly, her training allowing her to see the manipulation behind the apparent convenience. Certain patterns indicated safe passage routes known only to her people. Specific crystal color gradients signaled stable ground with minimal sensor coverage. Particular tree formations marked corridors that avoided the forest's most active defensive zones. She identified these markers through combinations of visual cues and subtle energy readings that my equipment barely detected. Each verified route felt like unlocking a door in a maze that had been designed to remain closed to outsiders. Color changes in flora signaled danger zones with reliable consistency. Vibrant purple blooms indicated areas with heightened thermal sensitivity. Deep blue moss warned of vibration detection systems. Silver-leafed plants marked zones where energy emissions would trigger rapid response. Saya monitored these indicators constantly, adjusting our route in real time based on the shifting biological signals. The forest communicated its defensive status through this living display, if one knew how to read the language. We moved toward higher ground she recognized from some internal geography. The sloping terrain led to a ridgeline that promised better visibility and potentially safer travel. She identified specific rock formations that served as navigation landmarks, her confidence growing as we approached familiar territory. The elevation gain also meant moving away from the dense sensor networks that concentrated in lower valleys, where threats most commonly appeared. The terrain grew steeper, testing my carrying capacity despite the servo assistance. The litter's weight distribution became increasingly difficult to manage on sharp inclines. My boots slipped on smooth crystal surfaces, requiring constant adjustment to maintain balance. The armor's power levels dropped under the sustained strain, forcing me to rely more on physical strength. Each step upward demanded careful placement and controlled breathing to avoid triggering detection systems. Through sudden movements, her directions avoided 3 separate trap systems that would have ended our journey. She identified pressure-sensitive terrain that would have released containment fields. She spotted camouflaged pit traps lined with energy-draining crystals. She recognized areas where the canopy would release disabling spores if disturbed. Each avoided danger represented a potential catastrophe averted through her specialized knowledge. The forest was a gallery of horrors designed to capture or kill, and she knew every exhibit. The forest seemed to learn our movement patterns and adapt its responses. After the first hour, previously safe routes began showing increased sensor activity. Plants that had remained passive now reacted to our presence with defensive postures. The system appeared to be analyzing our progress and adjusting countermeasures accordingly. This adaptive quality made static navigation impossible, requiring constant innovation in our approach. We changed tactics frequently to avoid prediction and pattern recognition. We alternated between rapid movements and complete stillness. We varied our rhythm and changed directions randomly within safe parameters. We used different types of cover and concealment to prevent the system from developing effective response protocols. The constant adaptation drained mental energy, but kept us one step ahead of the forest's learning algorithms. The destination remained unknown, but trusted as our only viable objective. I had no coordinates or description, only Sia's assurance that sanctuary existed ahead. Her certainty carried the weight of experience, the conviction of someone who knew this territory intimately. We moved toward an invisible finish line, each step taking us deeper into unfamiliar landscape but following her internal map toward safety. The trust required felt enormous but necessary, the only alternative being certain capture or death in. The research station blended into cliffside so perfectly I nearly missed it until we were 20 meters out. What appeared to be natural rock formations resolved into structured domes covered in crystalline growth that matched the surrounding geology. The integration wasn't camouflage so much as organic unity, the structures seeming to grow from the mountain itself rather than being built upon it. The design demonstrated architectural philosophy fundamentally different from human approaches, prioritizing harmony with environment over visible presence. Organic architecture grown rather than built explained the seamless integration. The walls showed no joints or seams, flowing from foundation to dome in continuous curves. The materials had the same mineral composition as the surrounding rock, but with reinforced molecular structure. Windows appeared as slightly clearer crystal formations rather than installed panes. The entire complex felt like a natural feature that had evolved purpose rather than being constructed by external forces. This growing process likely accounted for the station's resilience and low environmental impact. It had withstood 15 years of abandonment through superior design and materials. The crystal structures showed minimal weathering, despite exposure to elements and residual energy from the forest's defensive systems. No cracks or structural compromises were visible even at close inspection. The station's integration with the cliff face provided natural protection from wind shear and energy discharges that would have damaged freestanding construction. Time had merely added additional mineral deposits that enhanced rather than degraded the structures. Bioengineered systems maintained basic functions through automated processes. As we approached, subtle lighting activated along pathways, responding to our presence with soft illumination. Environmental systems hummed to life, maintaining atmospheric conditions without visible vents or exchangers. The station wasn't just preserved, it was waiting, its systems in standby mode rather than shutdown. This level of automated maintenance suggested technology far beyond human station-keeping capabilities. The entrance responded to Sia's biometrics without visible scanners or interfaces. A section of wall shifted when she placed her hand against it, the crystal surface flowing open to reveal an airlock chamber. The mechanism operated silently, with no moving parts in the conventional sense, the material itself reconfigured to create an opening. The response was immediate and specific, recognizing her biological signature despite years of absence and significant physical trauma. Inside, technology hummed with standby power that felt alive rather than mechanical. The lighting adjusted to our presence, growing brighter as we moved deeper into the station. Environmental systems maintained perfect temperature and humidity, without detectable airflow. The power source remained mysterious. No generator sounds or energy conduits were visible, just seamless functionality throughout the complex. The station felt less like an abandoned facility and more like a dormant organism awaiting activation. Medical bays sprawled with advanced equipment that integrated seamlessly into organic walls. Examination tables grew from the floor as crystalline platforms that could reshape for different procedures. Monitoring equipment emerged from wall surfaces when approached, retracting when not needed. The entire bay could reconfigure based on medical requirements, with no permanent fixtures beyond the structural elements themselves. The technology felt both ancient and advanced, grown rather than manufactured. Diagnostic computers covered an entire wall with living interfaces that responded to proximity. The display surfaces were fluid crystal that could shift from anatomical diagrams to real-time scans with thought commands. The systems recognized Sia immediately, bringing up her physiological data without manual input. The technology used biological feedback rather than tactile interfaces, reading intention through neural patterns or subtle muscle movements. The learning curve felt steep but intuitive, like discovering abilities you didn't know you possessed. Regeneration chambers showed intact systems through their dormant illumination. 3 cylindrical units stood along one wall, their crystal surfaces faintly glowing with stored energy. The chambers could apparently handle everything from tissue repair to organ regeneration, based on the control interfaces. Their preservation was perfect. No dust accumulation or system degradation visible despite years of disuse. The technology represented medical capabilities that human science was still theorizing about. Pharmaceutical fabrication units stood ready with molecular assemblers that could create customized treatments. The units could synthesize medications based on genetic profiles and specific injury requirements. Sample containers held base materials that remained viable through perfect preservation systems. The technology could apparently create everything from pain management solutions to tissue regeneration compounds on demand. The capability to treat both human and alien physiology existed simultaneously, suggesting the station's creators had anticipated cross-species use. The med bay represented xenobiology mastery that made human medical facilities appear primitive by comparison. The technology didn't just treat different species, it understood them on fundamental biological levels that human science hadn't yet imagined. Every surface could reconfigure based on patient needs, growing examination platforms or retracting diagnostic equipment with silent efficiency. The entire space felt alive rather than mechanical, responding to our presence with subtle adjustments that anticipated requirements before we articulated them. Scanners adapted to multiple physiologies automatically without manual calibration. When we positioned Sia on the examination platform, the overhead arrays immediately began mapping her anatomical structures with precision my field equipment couldn't achieve. The displays showed real-time renderings of her circulatory, nervous, and musculoskeletal systems, highlighting the fracture sites with alarming clarity. The technology recognized her species instantly, pulling up reference data that showed optimal treatment protocols. The system even identified my human physiology as separate but compatible, adjusting environmental controls to maintain conditions suitable for both species simultaneously. Regeneration tech used biological building blocks harvested from the environment itself. The chambers didn't rely on synthetic materials, but utilized crystalline structures that could be programmed at molecular levels to match tissue requirements. The process involved guided cellular regeneration that worked with natural biological processes, rather than overriding them. The technology could apparently handle everything from simple bone knitting to complete limb regeneration, though Sia's injuries fell somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. The equipment prepared the building blocks while scanning her specific genetic markers to ensure perfect compatibility. Sia's leg required 8 hours for full healing according to the system's projections. The regeneration chamber enveloped her injured limb in a gel-like substance that supported the bone fragments while directing cellular growth. We watched on monitors as the fractures gradually closed, the bone matrix reforming with visible progress every 15 minutes. The process was completely automated once initiated, requiring no surgical intervention or manual guidance. The technology made my field splints and trauma care seem like ancient history compared to this precision healing. I studied the technology with professional fascination that temporarily overrode survival concerns. The medical systems demonstrated principles human researchers were still theorizing about: guided cellular regeneration, adaptive diagnostic interfaces, multi-species life support. Each piece of equipment represented breakthroughs that could revolutionize medical care across human space. The potential applications for battlefield medicine alone were staggering, offering recovery times measured in hours rather than months for severe injuries. Human medicine could learn from these systems if we could overcome the barriers to cooperation. The technology wasn't just advanced, it was fundamentally different in approach, working with biology rather than against it. The pharmaceutical synthesizers could create customized medications based on individual genetic profiles rather than standardized formulas. The diagnostic systems used holistic assessment rather than isolated symptom treatment. Every aspect reflected a medical philosophy that prioritized integration over intervention. The station's purpose was ecological containment, according to database records we accessed. It was designed to study and manage the forest's unique biological systems, preventing cross-contamination, while allowing research into the remarkable adaptations evolved there. The medical capabilities were originally intended for researchers working with potentially hazardous biological materials, providing treatment options for unknown pathogens or injuries. This explained the extreme caution in the design and the multiple redundant systems throughout the facility. It held knowledge beyond military applications that could benefit both our species. The databases contained extensive research on the forest ecosystems, including detailed maps of sensor networks and defensive systems. There were also records of previous contact attempts with other species, including some that ended successfully. The station was never intended as a military outpost but as a bridge between civilizations. Though that purpose had been forgotten during subsequent conflicts, we accessed databases while she healed, discovering the station's original mission parameters. The records showed that cooperation between our species had been attempted before, though those efforts failed due to cultural misunderstandings and external pressures. The medical technology was specifically designed to facilitate such cooperation by providing common ground through shared health concerns. The architects had understood that healing could build bridges where diplomacy failed. The potential for cooperation became obvious through the shared use of the medical systems. The technology treated us equally despite our biological differences, creating neutral territory where we were simply patients and caregivers rather than enemies. The station's very existence proved that our species could work together when focused on common goals like healing and survival. As Sia's leg gradually reformed in the regeneration chamber, I realized the medical breakthrough wasn't just about bone knitting. It was about building trust across species lines through demonstrated competence and shared vulnerability. We talked through the regeneration cycle as the chamber hummed around her leg. The medical unit's soft light filled the space, casting shifting patterns across the organic walls. Our conversation moved in quiet rhythms between updates from the equipment, the technology providing a neutral ground where words could flow without the immediate pressure of survival. The station's isolation created a bubble where we were just two beings sharing space and stories. The forest's threats temporarily held at bay. She spoke of her people's loneliness despite their independence ethic. The cultural emphasis on self-reliance created individuals of remarkable capability, but left little room for connection. Achievement brought status but not companionship, success without shared celebration. Her description painted a society of solitary figures moving through life with minimal contact, where asking for help represented failure rather than wisdom. The isolation seemed especially acute during times of injury or illness, when vulnerability highlighted the absence of support systems humans took for granted. I shared human tribal loyalty with openness to strangers, describing how our species balances group allegiance with willingness to aid outsiders. The concept of helping unknown individuals resonated differently than her culture's focus on self-sufficiency. I explained emergency response systems, community support networks, the basic assumption that someone would assist in crisis regardless of relationship. The idea that strangers might risk themselves for others without established obligation seemed to fascinate her. challenging fundamental assumptions about social organization. The phrase, "leave no one behind," resonated deeply with her in ways I hadn't anticipated. She repeated the words softly, testing their weight and meaning through the translation. The concept represented a communal commitment that her culture lacked, a promise that someone would always come looking. This simple military principle contained values she found both alien and compelling. The idea that individual worth extended beyond personal achievement to include responsibility for others. The phrase seemed to settle in her mind as something significant, a cultural artifact worth examining further. She asked about the moment she grabbed my shirt, seeking to understand the impulse that had overcome years of cultural conditioning. Her fingers had acted before her mind approved, reaching for connection when every lesson taught self-reliance. The gesture represented a breakdown of training in favor of something more fundamental, an instinct that surprised her as much as it surprised me. She wanted to understand what triggered that moment of vulnerability, whether it was the pain, the fear, or some deeper recognition of shared humanity. Trust isn't rational but born from shared need, we agreed. The bond forming between us hadn't developed through careful assessment of character or calculated risk management. It emerged from mutual dependence in extreme circumstances, the simple reality that we needed each other to survive. This practical foundation felt more reliable than abstract promises or formal agreements. Trust built through demonstrated actions rather than words. The station's medical technology provided concrete evidence of this trust, its cross-species capabilities proving that cooperation was possible at fundamental levels. We discussed ethics of cross-species care, while watching her leg gradually reform in the regeneration chamber. The technology treated us equally despite biological differences, creating a neutral space where medical need transcended species boundaries. This practical demonstration of shared vulnerability made philosophical questions more immediate. If we could heal each other, what other collaborations might be possible? The medical bay became a living argument against isolationism, its very existence proving that different species could develop common ground. The station provided safety for vulnerability that the forest never allowed. Within its organic walls, we could lower guards that had remained raised since first contact. The environment supported openness through its design, quiet, protected, focused on healing rather than conflict. This temporary sanctuary created space for conversations that would have been impossible while dodging sentinels or treating wounds in the open. The station understood vulnerability as part of its purpose, making room for the uncertainty and risk that came with genuine connection. By dawn, rescue had become partnership through the accumulated weight of shared experience. The dynamic had shifted from medic and patient to something more balanced and collaborative. We'd moved through fear, pain, and uncertainty together, building a working relationship that felt increasingly natural. The regeneration cycle completed as sunlight began filtering through the crystalline windows, her leg restored to full function. We stood together watching the forest awaken, the partnership feeling less like temporary alliance and more like foundation for something lasting. The alliance felt less impossible in the clear light of morning, the cultural divide seeming more bridgeable than before. What began as desperate survival tactics had developed into mutual respect and understanding. The night's conversations had revealed common ground where none was expected, shared values beneath surface differences. We prepared to face whatever came next with a coordination that felt earned rather than forced, the partnership having been tested and proven through practical challenges. The forest still waited outside, but we faced it with better resources than either of us had possessed alone. Guardian patrols intensified around the station as we prepared to leave. The forest's defensive systems had recalibrated after detecting our presence, sending heavier units to secure the perimeter. We watched from the station's observation port as six-legged sentinels moved in coordinated patterns, their sensor domes sweeping the area with increased frequency. The patrol intervals shortened from 20 minutes to 5, creating narrow windows for movement between their circuits. The station's concealment remained effective, but couldn't last indefinitely against this level of scrutiny. Sentinels tracked our movement with precision that felt almost preternatural. Their sensors detected minute disturbances in the environment, displaced soil, residual heat signatures, even the subtle pressure changes from our breathing when we ventured too close to openings. The machines communicated through the crystalline network, sharing targeting data and movement predictions. Each time we considered exiting, another patrol would adjust its route to cover potential escape paths. The forest was learning our patterns, adapting its defense in real time based on observed behavior. Sia explained the Kethalori interpretation of strength during a lull between patrols. Her people valued self-sufficiency not as isolation, but as demonstrated capability. Asking for help wasn't weakness if it followed exhaustive independent effort. The key distinction lay in proving one's competence before seeking assistance. This cultural nuance explained her initial hesitation to speak, until all other options were exhausted. The concept made human openness seem reckless to her people, like showing your cards before seeing the dealer's hand. Human openness appeared as curious strength through her evolving perspective. Our willingness to aid strangers represented either monumental confidence or dangerous naivety from her cultural viewpoint. She was beginning to understand it as a different kind of power, the strength to risk resources without guaranteed return. This cultural difference created tension even as it fostered mutual curiosity. Our alliance was becoming a live experiment in whether these opposing worldviews could find productive balance. Her culture valued practical aid and verification above abstract promises. They assessed worth through demonstrated skills rather than stated intentions. This explained why she'd watched my medical procedures so intently. She was verifying competence according to her people's standards. The station's technology had provided objective proof of my capabilities, but her culture would require further demonstration before granting full trust. Every action carried weight in their evaluation system, with mistakes potentially invalidating previous successes. We moved toward cliff face settlements carefully after identifying a patrol gap. The terrain offered natural concealment but required navigating narrow ledges above significant drops. The path followed mineral deposits that interfered with sensor readings, creating temporary blind spots in the forest coverage. We moved in synchronized silence using hand signals developed during our time in the station. The recovered leg gave Sia full mobility, her movement precise and confident on the unstable footing. Protocol required respect for local sovereignty when approaching her people's territory. I followed her lead on customs and boundaries, allowing her to determine the approach vector and timing. Human diplomatic training emphasized non-interference until invited, but her culture demanded more active demonstration of deference. I maintained separation distance, avoided direct eye contact with potential lookouts, and kept my hands visible at all times. These small gestures communicated recognition of their authority over the territory. My medical expertise needed adaptation proof beyond the station's treatment. Her people would require demonstration on their own injured, using their facilities and observing my methods. The cultural value on verification meant they'd want to see the techniques rather than hear descriptions. I mentally prepared to work without human standard equipment, using whatever resources they provided while explaining each adaptation for their observers. The proof would come through results, not credentials. The terrain tested our recovered capabilities with sudden challenges. Rock slides forced detours across unstable slopes. Unexpected energy discharges from crystalline formations required rapid evasion. The cliff face itself shifted subtly in response to our passage, the living rock adjusting to create obstacles. Sia's knowledge of the geology helped anticipate these changes, but each adjustment consumed precious time and energy. The environment felt actively hostile rather than passively dangerous. Sanctuary remained uncertain ahead despite Sia's confidence. Her people might reject the alliance based on cultural prejudice or security concerns. The settlements could be abandoned or destroyed since her last contact. Our arrival might trigger defensive responses rather than welcome. We navigated the final approach with caution, aware that the greatest danger might await at our destination rather than behind us in the forest. The cliff settlements rose ahead, their organic structures blending into the rock face, silent and watchful. Kethalori demanded demonstration of value as condition for sanctuary. Their leader stood with arms crossed, golden eyes assessing my capabilities without prejudice or mercy. The settlement's council watched from raised platforms, their postures conveying open skepticism. No credentials or promises would suffice. Only visible proof of medical competence would grant us protection. The air in the chamber felt heavy with unspoken judgment, each breath measured against their cultural standards of worth. 3 injured villagers required treatment under observation. They were brought into the medical bay on repulsor gurneys, each case representing different challenges. The first was a construction worker with crush injuries from fallen rock. The second had plasma burns across their torso from an energy conduit rupture. The third struggled with respiratory distress that standard treatments hadn't eased. Their conditions spanned trauma, tissue damage, and systemic illness, creating a comprehensive test of cross-species medical knowledge. Anatomy differences presented fresh challenges with each examination. The construction worker's internal organ placement didn't match human patterns, requiring mental recalibration of standard anatomical landmarks. Muscle groups attached at different angles, nerve clusters followed unfamiliar pathways, and the skeletal structure showed reinforcement points where human bodies had weaknesses. Each assessment required discarding assumptions and building understanding from first principles guided by scanner readings and SIA's translations. Internal injuries needed unconventional access points for treatment. The crush victim's abdominal cavity showed bleeding from organs positioned behind protective bony plates. Standard surgical approaches would cause more damage than they repaired. I used the settlement's medical scanners to map alternative access routes between rib-like structures, finding pathways that minimized tissue disruption. The procedure felt like performing surgery through a maze where the walls could shift without warning. Dual hearts complicated trauma assessment and treatment priorities. The cardiovascular system had redundant circulation that could mask shock symptoms until collapse became imminent. Each heart served different vascular networks with overlapping backup systems. Monitoring equipment showed two separate pressure readings that needed simultaneous observation. The injury had compromised one heart's function, but the other maintained adequate circulation, buying time for careful intervention rather than emergency measures. Burn care required adapted techniques for alien tissue response. The plasma burns showed deeper tissue damage than human burns would at equivalent exposure. The skin's higher thermal conductivity transferred heat more effectively to underlying structures. Standard cooling protocols proved inadequate, requiring combined approaches using the settlement's tissue regeneration technology and topical applications formulated for their biology. Each treatment adjustment needed verification through continuous cellular-level monitoring. Infection control against alien pathogens demanded complete recalibration of protocols. The respiratory case involved microorganisms unlike any in human medical databases. Their metabolic pathways responded differently to antimicrobial agents, requiring custom pharmaceutical formulations. I used the settlement's molecular synthesizers to create targeted treatments based on pathogen analysis, adjusting concentrations for their unique metabolism. The process felt like solving an equation with unknown variables under time pressure. Sia translated medical concepts carefully during the procedures. She converted terminology between languages, explaining human medical approaches in terms her people could understand. Her role went beyond translation to cultural interpretation, framing my actions within their value system. She emphasized the adaptability and respect for their physiology, demonstrated throughout the treatments. Each explanation helped bridge the gap between different healing traditions. Success meant temporary sanctuary and access to communication systems. The council observed each procedure with critical attention, noting technical competence and adaptive thinking. Their evaluation considered not just outcomes but approach and attitude toward their people. A positive assessment would grant us protection and resources to contact our respective commands. The stakes extended beyond immediate survival to potential future cooperation between our species. Failure meant expulsion into hunting grounds patrolled by sentinels. Without sanctuary, we'd be forced back into the forest with limited supplies and increased enemy awareness. The Kethalori would provide no assistance to those who failed to demonstrate value. Their cultural values demanded this harsh practicality. Resources couldn't be wasted on those who couldn't contribute to community survival. Each medical decision carried the weight of that possible future. The operation succeeded against odds that would have broken most field medics. All 3 patients stabilized under my care, their conditions improving with adapted treatments. The crush victim's internal bleeding stopped using pressure techniques modified for their anatomy. The burn patient's tissue regeneration began responding to customized pharmaceutical compounds. The respiratory case improved with targeted antimicrobials formulated against alien pathogens. The settlement's medical scanners confirmed successful interventions, their displays showing recovery trajectories that satisfied even the most skeptical observers. Leadership extended formal hospitality through precise rituals that carried weight beyond ceremony. The clan elder presented a carved crystal tablet acknowledging my status as guest healer. This granted me access to living quarters, food services, and limited movement within the settlement's secured areas. The gesture wasn't warm welcome, but professional recognition, a contractual agreement rather than emotional acceptance. My value had been demonstrated and would be maintained through continued performance. Medical exchange became an ongoing requirement of the sanctuary arrangement. I trained 3 apprentices in human emergency techniques adapted for their physiology. They learned pressure point control for bleeding, field splinting methods for dense bones, and infection protocols for alien pathogens. The teaching proceeded through demonstration and repetition, with Sia translating concepts that lacked direct equivalence. Each lesson reinforced my value to the community, while expanding their medical capabilities. The settlement offered social possibilities I hadn't anticipated. Community meals involved complex seating arrangements that reflected status and relationships. Ceremonial observances marked daily cycles with rituals that blended practical purpose with cultural significance. The social structure allowed limited interaction between species, with clear boundaries governing what questions could be asked and what topics remained forbidden. These interactions felt cautiously exploratory, both sides testing the limits of cross-cultural engagement. Their leader's daughter expressed interest through carefully coded gestures I almost missed. She began attending medical training sessions, asking strategic questions that demonstrated both intelligence and curiosity. She offered assistance with equipment preparation and cleanup, creating opportunities for conversation outside formal instruction. Her attention carried political implications beyond personal attraction. The clan leader's daughter didn't engage with outsiders without calculated purpose. Saya weighed complexities of entanglement with visible tension. She recognized the political implications of the leader's daughter's attention and understood the potential complications for both of us. Her own status as a returned warrior created competing obligations to family and community. We discussed the situation during off hours, analyzing the risks and potential benefits of various approaches. The personal and political had become inseparable in this tightly structured society. Terms were clear: teaching for protection, skill for sanctuary. I continued residence depended on maintaining my value to the community through medical instruction and treatment. The settlement provided security from the forest's threats, but expected professional contribution in return. This practical arrangement suited their cultural values. No one received something without offering equivalent value. The clarity felt reassuring despite the constant performance pressure. Human Command declared Sia missing, presumed dead after 6 months without contact. The standard declaration arrived through a secure diplomatic channel, cold formal language extinguishing her military status. The document listed her service record and offered condolences to next of kin. This bureaucratic ending to her military life felt anticlimactic compared to the reality of her survival. The declaration carried unexpected emotional weight despite its predictable arrival. I faced staying or returning alone when the next supply ship arrived in 3 months. The choice involved practical considerations about medical resources, cultural adaptation, and professional future. Human space offered familiar surroundings but limited the cross-species medical work I'd begun. The settlement provided unique opportunities, but demanded permanent commitment to their society. The decision would define not just my location, but my identity and purpose. The choice became about where I belonged, rather than where duty called. The settlement felt increasingly like home despite its alien surroundings. My medical work had meaning here, my skills valued in ways human postings never achieved. Sia's presence created personal connection that outweighed institutional loyalty. The forest outside remained dangerous, but inside these crystalline walls I'd found something resembling peace. The supply ship's arrival felt like an approaching verdict rather than rescue. The diplomatic ship found us 3 months later, changed by the forest and what we built together. I had established a joint medical research program with Sia, combining human emergency techniques with Kethalori regeneration technology. Our work now serves 3 species from this settlement on the cliff's edge. We published our findings under both our names, a paper dedicated to those who don't abandon others in need. The alliance proved that survival requires connection across any divide. Home isn't a place, but whoever stands with you when the darkness gathers.